Way back in 2005, I was a 19-year-old lad living in Sheffield when I discovered a little band called Dimmu Borgir. Dimmu Borgir are a band who play black metal, and their songs are called things like Blood Hunger Doctrine, Progenies of the Great Apocalypse, or the charmingly named The Death of All Saints and the Kingdom of Hell. They dress like you might imagine them to as well, as in nothing but leather, boots with spikes on, and lots of what they call corpse paint. Picture the band Kiss and the way they paint their faces. Now imagine the most monstrously unsettling version of that possible, and that's what corpse paint is. They're not trying to look cool as such, they're trying to look genuinely unsettling, and from the moment I saw it, I was entranced. But it wasn't just the music or the clothes that fascinated me, it was the culture, and that culture can be best summed up with the story of a band called Mayhem. Or maybe it's more of a chapter in the story of Mayhem, but it's a big one. So, long story short, one current member of the band Euronymous and a former member of the band Var Vikernes got into a dispute involving royalties. But then, rather than see each other in court, they got all gangsta rap about it and started issuing death threats to one another. Eventually, the former band member tracks down the current band member and pays him a visit at home. Then, after a violent struggle, the current band member is murdered. The police then raid the murderer's house only to find a ton of ammunition and explosives, and while he denied planning some sort of attack in court, the police put forward a pretty convincing argument that he was planning one, and he was sent to prison. Now, I know how childish this is going to sound, but I'm almost of the opinion that if you don't regret at least some of the stuff that you did and thought as a teen, you neither lived nor grown. But back when I first read all that stuff about Dead and Euronymous and Var Vikernes, I thought it was cool. These guys didn't just talk the talk, they walked the walk. They didn't just write about pain and suffering and death, they were actively inflicting and reveling in it, and something about that authenticity was magnetic to me. The same could be said for tens of thousands of other fans too, fans who saw their own anguish and frustration reflected back at them through black metal music. A big theme in black metal was a rejection of modern society, with fans saying they felt more at home in the woods than in a town or city. And so there were all these interlinking themes of violence and isolation, anger and depression, all wrapped up in a Satan-worshipping bow. And while that all might sound quite standard for a teenage boy and his innate sense of rebellion, black metal attracted a much more genuine sort of malice. As I got more and more into black metal, I started making friends who shared my much more darker tastes. I still chilled with my old metalhead schoolmates, and I still count one of them as a close friend even all these years later. But then once a week I'd head over to a black metal night at a metal pub we used to frequent, and that's where I met Toby. Toby called himself Corpse Eater, but I'll just call him Toby here. Of all the black metal fans that used to drink in the Dove and Rainbow, he was the most hardcore. He also had what you might call an aura of darkness about him. Toby didn't just make black metal his whole personality. He'd actually been to Norway, the genre's birthplace, and had visited the site of the Holmenkollen Chapel. It had been rebuilt by the time he visited, and it had been burned down in the early 90s by the same guy who murdered his former bandmate, Varg Vikernes, and to Toby, seeing it was akin to a religious experience. He considered it a kind of pilgrimage because he wanted to do exactly the same thing in the UK. It was also a pilgrimage that was recognized and respected by black metal fans everywhere because Toby had basically spent all his money on a ferry ticket from Newcastle to Norway via Amsterdam, then begged, borrowed, or stole in order to eat and travel. He told people he slept outdoors in Norway in the middle of winter and that he'd nearly died as a result. I didn't quite believe all that at first, but Toby had the photographs on his phone to prove it. There were several grainy selfies of him taking shelter in a shop doorway in Oslo, and he had actual snow clinging to his big black beard. I had to admit, I was impressed. Not quite in awe like some of the other black metal fans who drank in that bar, but impressed nevertheless. Then over weeks and months that followed our initial meeting, me and Toby got to be good friends. Toby was good fun, but he was wild. And I mean really wild. He didn't work, but he didn't claim benefits either. Yet somehow he always had a bit of money to spend on vodka or secondhand leathers, and if you ever asked him where he got it, he'd always reply with a variation of "mind your own business." And that's why I didn't ask any questions when he told me he got 2 tickets for a music festival called Bloodstock, which was taking place down near Derby for a few days in August. And while Bloodstock isn't strictly a black metal festival, it's about as close to one as we were going to find. He made me give him the money for the ticket, and it was also my job to get a hold of a tent and a lift down to Derby, but I was well up for it, and I was chuffed that he'd actually bought me a ticket. Toby could have picked anyone to take to Bloodstock, but he picked me, and while that was probably because he knew that I had access to both a car and a tent, it still felt special, I guess. We drove down on Friday the 14th, and we parked my car and started making our way towards the gates, and I thought we were in for the time of our lives. It was my first ever music festival, and I was buzzing to be there. Toby, on the other hand, being a few years older, had been to loads, so he took the lead. We found ourselves a spot to camp at the very edge of an open field, so we had trees on one side of us and a sea of tents on the other. We then set up the tent, found ourselves a burger van and had some food, and then wandered around the festival site catching bands as we went. We were drinking all day, and then the last thing I remember before almost blacking out completely was catching Arch Enemy on the main stage. And the next thing I remember is waking up in my tent the next morning on my own. Toby had decided to sleep among the trees, on the ground, with his shirt off, and he was still passed out when I went looking for him and eventually found him. We were both pretty hungover, so obviously not feeling our best, but there was something about the way he was acting that put a bit of tension in the air. You see, Toby was always a very dark and moody sort of person, and while you met a lot of people like that in the black metal community, being either angry or depressed or hateful was kind of their whole personality. He had his moments of kindness and compassion, but only here and there, and you only ever saw him like that if you were very close with him. But then, even after all of his brooding and moodiness, there was something extra dark about Toby that morning. Toby didn't really like the sound of his own voice, and by that I mean he was a real talker. I didn't mind, to be honest. He was always coming out with juicy pieces of black metal lore and stuff, so it was interesting for the most part. But then that morning, there was hardly a word out of him. I kept asking if he was all right, if anything had happened the previous night that I wasn't remembering. But he said he was fine, and that he was just regretting the amount that he had to drink the previous night. Apparently he'd wandered around until sunrise after I'd crashed in our tent and had enjoyed some very interesting conversations with someone he'd met on his travels. I asked if it was anything I'd find interesting, but when he just shook his head, I decided to leave it. Toby seemed to perk up a little bit after we got some breakfast and had ourselves a little bit of a baby wipe shower. And then after covering ourselves in corpse paint, we started to get very excited as we made our way to the stage where Cradle of Filth was playing. It was the most animated I'd seen him for quite some time, and at first, he was in a good mood, and people around us were enjoying his antics, some of which included Growl screaming the words "Av Satanus" and pouring packets of fake blood all over himself when he was already covered in corpse paint. But then once Cradle of Filth took the stage and started their set, Toby went absolutely haywire. At first, all he did was headbang and scream along with the songs, but then about halfway through the set, he started getting physical with me. He'd grab me by the shoulders, scream in my face, and sometimes he'd bang our foreheads together so hard it actually hurt. But as weird as it sounds, I didn't really mind. We'd actually do stuff like that quite often back in my flat after the pub, so I just screamed back at him and joined him in the headbanging. But then he started doing it to other people, and some of them didn't seem to appreciate it at all. A few guys seemed to enjoy it at first, when Toby grabbed them and started screaming, but when he headbutted them hard enough for it to hurt, they'd either shove him off or try and go for him, at which point his mates would hold him back to stop everyone getting carted out by security. I tried to calm him down a bit to get him to stop hassling people near us, but not only would he not listen, he got worse and worse and worse. Eventually, I kind of snapped at him, and after dragging him away to the side of the marquee away from the people, I told him to chill out or I was leaving. And his response was to throw a punch at me, a really bloody hard one too, and if he hadn't been so drunk, it might have connected. And well, that was it. I went mental. and after we started scuffling, it took maybe a minute or two before the pair of us were getting dragged out of the tent by members of security. And the next thing I know, I'm outside, and I'm trying to explain to the security guy that me and Toby are just friends that have gotten into a bit of a bust-up, but all he's interested in is separating us. I suppose that was their job, wasn't it? To keep people separated if they're fighting, but by the time he'd finished giving me a warning and told me to cool down before coming back into the tent, Toby was nowhere to be seen. I had a little look around, calling out his name, and while you might think that it would be easy to spot a 6-foot man in corpse paint who's also covered in fake blood, I had no luck. Toby had apparently vanished. I spent the next few hours looking for him, then giving his phone a call every so often to see if he'd pick up, but he didn't. As I walked, it slowly began to dawn on me that I was probably going to have to spend the day alone, and in the end, that's what I did. I had a mooch about, went to see the bands I wanted to see, and although I kept an eye out for Toby at all the places I thought he might be, I didn't catch sight of him. To say it was disappointing would be an understatement, a massive one, and then after catching the last few bands on the main stage, I made my way back to our tent in the hopes that I'd bump into Toby on the way back. When I got there, the tent was empty, but it was also unzipped, so I knew Toby must have been back at some point. Then right as I'm about to give him a call, I hear someone calling my name from the trees near our tent. It was Toby. I was just relieved to know that he'd made it back okay, and the first thing I did was apologize for that scuffle so we'd start off the interaction on good terms. I'd never gotten anything like that with him before, physical violence I mean, so I didn't really know how he was going to take it. But from the sound of his voice, he didn't seem to mind at all. He said something like, "Don't worry about it, all forgotten," and I could tell that he was drunk from the way that he was slurring his words. But then he said, "Listen, I found something, and you need to see it." I asked him what, and in a voice that sounded unusually giddy, Toby said it was a surprise. And when I say unusually giddy, I mean I'd never heard Toby sound like that before, ever. So my first thought was, okay, he's probably on mushrooms or MDMA or something because this is not like him at all. I asked him what kind of surprise as I walked towards him, and even though it was almost pitch black, I could see his bright white torso and face still covered in the corpse paint. Looking back on it, he looked terrifying, but I was too drunk, tired, and relieved to do anything but walk towards him. As I got closer, he turned away from me. Then as I started following him into the trees, I asked a second time what his surprise was. He replied, and I'll never forget the way he said this, "Something I've wanted to show you for ages now." Then he sort of started mumbling to himself. Stuff I mostly couldn't hear, but could make out the odd word. I know he said stuff like effing posers at one point, but Toby was always complaining about what he called black metal posers, so I didn't think much of it. I just carried on following him, thinking he might have stolen someone's stash or something, and he'd hidden it among the trees. Then when he knelt down in the dark by a tree and picked something up off the ground, I thought my little theory had been proven right. But then Toby stood up and turned around, and I saw what was in his hand, and it didn't much look like a stash of anything. It looked like some kind of cloth or leather wrap, and it seemed to be too flat though, not like a bag or a pouch or anything. So as Toby's unwrapping whatever's inside, I'm watching in my booze-induced haze with my brain only working half as fast as it should. Because when that wrapping fell away, revealing a long, curved, and silvery-looking blade in Toby's hand, all I said at first was, "Cool, where'd you get that?" But Toby didn't say anything. Instead, his face twisted up with this horrible look of determination, and the big gothic-looking Bowie knife thing that he had started trembling in his hand. I remember taking a step back and asking him, "Mate, what are you doing?" But he still didn't say anything. All I could hear was his breathing getting deeper and louder as he worked himself up to do something I never thought possible. I asked him again what the F he was playing at, but that time, he lunged at me with the knife, swinging it wildly as he did so. He swung it so hard it made that little swishing sound as it split the air, which should also give you a clue to how large it was, not just how sharp or how fast he swung it. I had enough distance between us to avoid his swing, but afterwards, I had to speed up to keep a safe distance because Toby was starting to speed up and getting more and more keyed up as he did. I went from asking what the hell had gotten into him to screaming for him to keep his distance and stop swinging the blade. We'd now gone past our tent, and I was walking backwards past other people while trying not to trip over their guide ropes. I was still shouting at him to stop, and since there were literally hundreds of people around, gathered in little circles outside their groupings of tents, it took just a few seconds before people clocked what was going on. I was literally begging them to help me when this big fella stepped in. I remember he had a mohawk, a long one tied back in a ponytail with the sides of his head shaved. He stepped towards Toby, saying something like, "That's a big knife you got there, mate. Why don't you give it here before someone gets hurt?" He then took one fast final step towards Toby and tried to grab him by the knife arm, but Toby turned and slashed at him. This big fella immediately backed away, holding his arm and looking shocked while shouting, "You're gonna cut me!" Something like that. Toby turned back to me, and when I took a step backwards, I felt my leg got caught on something before I fell backwards onto my arse. I thought, I'm dead. And I'll never forget how incredibly scared I was looking up at him. But after taking a couple of more steps towards me, Toby was suddenly mobbed by a crowd of people. It was the most stupidly brave thing I'd ever seen in my life. One of the mob was a girl, maybe only 5 foot something, and I think that she might have been the girlfriend of the big fella who got cut. She was right there in the front line of the little circle that closed around Toby, screaming stuff like, "Come on then." I remember watching in awe for a second before someone dragged me up and asked if I was okay. It might sound a bit weird, but at the time, I was terrified for Toby. It was like the fear of him suddenly became fear for him, and I can't overstate how much it twisted up in my head to think that people protecting me were also threatening my best mate's life, just as he was threatening theirs. There was also this feeling of absolute helplessness to cap off what's probably the worst experience of my whole life, because there wasn't a single thing that I could do except just stand there and watch it all unfold. The group of strangers kept the circle around him, but while the people Toby was facing backed off a bit to stay out of slashing range, the people behind him started rushing in and trying to kick him or shove him. They were hit-and-run attacks, so Toby would spin around slashing, but they'd immediately back off. Then the people he was facing only a second before started doing the same thing, rushing in with flying kicks before backing off again. It didn't go on for long before a kick knocked him off balance and then a shove sent him to the ground. Then when that happened, people just dived on him, and it was complete and utter chaos for a few minutes until a mix of festival security and police ran up shining torches and screaming at people to get back. It was madness, complete and utter madness, and I had this horrible feeling of dread that when they cleared away all those people, there might be 1 or 2 who didn't get up again, Toby included. Once the police arrived, it didn't take long before people either ran or backed off from kicking the crap out of Toby. I remember seeing a policeman putting handcuffs on him as he lay on his front with his face all covered in blood. He'd gotten the kicking of a lifetime, and he didn't so much as squirm when the policeman locked his wrists together. I don't think he even knew what was going on, and I remember thinking that he must have been knocked out and was only just coming to. Someone gave one of the policemen the knife that he'd been trying to stab me with, and then someone else directed one of them over to me like, "He's the one he was trying to stab." That policeman ended up asking me questions. Then the next thing I remember, a load of medical people were treating Toby, along with, I think, 3 or 4 people he'd managed to cut or who'd been hurt in the chaos. I remember telling the policeman that we'd had a bit of a scrap earlier that day. Then I hadn't talked to him all day till I returned to my tent at the end of the last show. He asked if Toby was on drugs, and at first I sort of instinctually said no. But then realizing how stupid I was being, I changed my story and told them that, yeah, Toby was probably on all sorts of things. But that still didn't explain why he'd tried to kill me. He was a weird guy, one that many people might call a psycho, but I hadn't known him to have any violent tendencies. Not till that night at Bloodstock back in 2009. And looking back on it all these years later, saying that I didn't know that he had violent tendencies seems kinda naive. Toby glorified violence, and he did it constantly. Deep down, I think I always knew that he had it in him to really hurt someone. I just didn't think that person would be me, and neither did I expect the entire black metal community in Sheffield to take his side and not mine. When I realized they all cared more about his arrest and trial than they did about whether or not I was okay, I stopped drinking at that bar and stopped hanging around with the people who drank there. They never said it outright, but I knew they blamed me somehow for what had happened to him, and I had to explain to one girl how it wasn't even me that was pressing charges. It was the CPS on behalf of the people he'd slashed. I heard he got 2 years in prison from one of the few people I stayed in touch with. Then after that, I never saw or heard from him ever again, and went back to hanging out exclusively with my friends from school, half of which knew what a wrong'un Toby was from the moment they'd met him in that bar. I still listen to a bit of black metal every now and then, but since my tastes have evolved over the last 20 years or so, it's mainly for the nostalgia value. I don't idolize the bands anymore, and I find the vibe of some of the darker bands just kinda cringeworthy these days. Music is supposed to make people happy and bring them together, and for the most part, that's exactly what black metal does. But I know firsthand that for some people, all that worship of Satan, violence, and death, it's not just theater. It's a reflection of something much, much darker they carry inside of them. My name's Sarah, and going to a music festival a few years back was somehow one of the best and worst decisions I have ever made in my life. It wasn't a huge festival, and the guys who organized it were total idiots, so I don't want to give them any free promotion by saying which one it was. But it took place in the middle of nowhere, in a whole bunch of fields, and it was mostly EDM all night until dawn. We bought our tickets online, bought camping equipment, and the whole deal. And we were super stoked to attend, and while that first night was amazing, the second night, not so much. A friend and I had been dancing in a big tent together to a DJ we both liked, then after a set was over, we decided to take a break and get some water. Once we were outside, she realized that she needed to go do something related to feminine hygiene. I offered to join her, if only for the company, and she said no, it was fine, that she'd just go to our tent and come straight back again. I was like, okay, cool, and then watched her walk off before heading back inside with my water. Now, I'm a girl in my 20s. I work out, and I've been told I'm pretty, so I'm used to a certain amount of male attention, and I'm not obnoxious about it. I usually just lie and tell the guy I have a boyfriend, even in situations where I might kind of be into a guy, because I don't want to have to play the dating game when I'm just trying to have fun with friends, you know? I'd already had one or two guys shoot their shot with me, and they'd taken it like gentlemen when I kinda told them to buzz off. But then this one guy started trying to dance with me. Some dumb, sloppy drunk in a dirty white tee who smelled like stale beer and cigarettes, and he would not take no for an answer. It got to the point where I just wasn't having fun anymore, so I waited for an opportune moment to slip away from the guy and then walked all the way outside the tent to wait for my friend outside. I thought that I'd given the guy the slip at first, like I really did wait till his back was turned away and darted off into the crowd and toward the exit. But somehow he managed to tail me outside and then started asking where I was going and why I was ditching him. Now I said, I told you 20 times already, I have a boyfriend. But then he says, it's chill, we're just vibing out, you know? But in a way that was clearly not friend-zoning me in the minimal. Things were actually starting to get pretty heated, with the guy saying something along the lines of, what the hell's your goddamn problem? You think you're better than me? And then suddenly, a stranger stepped in. Lisa, the stranger said, like they were pleasantly surprised to see me. Oh my god, what the hell are you doing here? Mom didn't tell me you were home from college. And to make it clear, I had never seen this person before in my life, and I had never been to college. But they seemed to insist that me and him were cousins. He mentioned it like twice in quick succession, then turned to the guy bothering me, saying, and who's this guy? Are you gonna introduce me? I told him I didn't know the guy, and then my new cousin turned to him and said, hey man, I get you two were hanging out, but do you mind if we have ourselves a little cousin catch-up time? It's been a while since me and Lisa have seen each other. Now my name is not Lisa, but I just went with it, and the guy bothering me seemed to swallow that hook, line, and sinker. The stranger even topped it off with a bit of a playful but firm, you're not about to start hitting on my cousin right in front of me, are you, bruh? Incredibly, the guy that had been bothering me, who'd been aggravated to the point I thought that he might start a fight, just laughed. It was like the kind stranger had rolled a charisma check in D&D and then hit a perfect natural 20 right there in front of me. The guy bothering me then says, "Me? Nah, man, it's all good. I'm just out here vibing." Then after reaching in to give us both fist pumps, he wandered back into the big tent to rejoin the party. I remember turning to the kind stranger, half stunned and half impressed, before thanking him for stepping in so masterfully. He said it was no problem, and that the cousin trick had worked a bunch of times before. He then introduced himself as Aaron, and I jokingly introduced myself as Lisa before telling him my real name. I explained the situation, and not just that the guy had been bugging me, but that I had been waiting for my friend to come back out from our tent. It then occurred to me that she'd been an unusually long time, like way longer than either of us expected, and that it might be an idea to go check on her now. And I said that to Aaron, saying it was nice meeting him and I was grateful for him stepping in, but that I had to go find my friend because I was worried about her. He then suggested he accompany me to keep annoying guys at bay, kind of like a free bodyguard, and I just say, "All right, sure, why not?" We started walking and talking, swapping festival stories and talking about which DJs we enjoyed so far, and Aaron seemed like a great guy. He'd gotten a ride with a few friends of his who were apparently off seeing a DJ he wasn't a huge fan of, so he decided to kind of wander around soaking up the vibes and discovering some new music. That's when he saw me. I told him, before he got the wrong idea, that I had a boyfriend. This was a lie, but like I said, it's pretty liberating not feeling that dating pressure or having to assume a guy has ulterior motives when it seems like he's just being nice. Aaron then says, "I figured you might be taken, but that's not what I'm about," and explained he too was in a relationship, but that it was complicated. I asked if all his vocabulary was taken from Facebook relationship statuses, and he just sort of laughed and asked if that's how I was thanking him for saving my ass, with insults. And we went back and forth like that for a while, and I'll admit, I started really enjoying Aaron's company. But as he passed the area his tent was at, he asked me to wait a minute while he went and got something from his bag. I said sure, and then a minute later, he came back with 2 bottles of water. Now, it was a super warm evening, but the humidity was out of this world. So while there was a lot of alcohol being drunk, there was a butt ton of water being drank too, and mainly by people who were on things other than booze. Aaron then comes back with 2 unopened bottles of water and offers me one. I had my own water bottle, but it was only a quarter full and warm, and I probably could have used a fresh one. But accepting a fresh bottle of water from Aaron would have also broken the #1 rule of festivals or raves for me. Do not, under any circumstances, accept drinks from people you do not trust with your life. It's probably the oldest, most tried, and most tested rule of raving and nightclubbing, and it's usually the first thing most girls learn whenever they head out into the night for the first time. Rules, as they say, are written in blood, and if that is true, this chapter is a long one. I feel like everyone knows someone who's been spiked at a party these days, or someone who at least got scared that they were having too much to drink on an empty stomach, so it's one of these things that's firmly built into what you might call the collective consciousness of girls. And this meant that the second Aaron offered me the water bottle, I was instantly sort of like, nah. I didn't voice any of my suspicions out loud. I didn't want to offend the guy, but I also think that he took a major hint when I said, "No thanks, I'm good." And then he responds, "Huh, okay. I guess I'll keep it handy if you change your mind." And I remember thinking, I definitely won't be changing my mind about that water anytime soon, but I thanked him anyway, and we kept on walking towards where me and my friend were camped out. I guess that might sound super odd to some, like I mistrust the guy enough that I won't drink his water, but I'm okay with him walking me up to my tent. I suppose it is kind of contradictory, but I didn't make the rules when it comes to keeping safe at events like this. I just follow them, and they've worked out for me so far. Anyway, Aaron and I wandered back to my tent, chatting back and forth the whole time, and I remember getting some really good vibes from him. But then, when we get back to the tent, I excused myself to go check on my friend. I was worried she might not be there, in which case, where the hell was she? But not only was she in the tent, but she was fast asleep and snoring. I woke her up to check on her, and she apologized for not texting after explaining that she was just exhausted. She only planned on taking a power nap, but she must have totally slept through the alarm. I said it was fine. I was just relieved to know that she was okay. But since I didn't feel like settling down just yet, I'd be back in a few hours after taking a walk around the festival site. I already made it up in my mind that Aaron was chill enough to take another walk with, even if I didn't quite trust him enough to drink his water yet, and so I wished her good night, zipped our tent back up, and then stepped my way through the mess of guide ropes to where Aaron was waiting for me. And in so many words, I explained the situation and that I had a couple of hours to spare. And then Aaron said that we should just keep going on what we've been doing, walking and talking, and since I thought that was a good idea, I accepted. I didn't feel much like dancing, and it was so late that all the food places had closed up for the night, and so we ended up just wandering around, soaking up the vibes on what was an unusually warm summer night. And so after maybe an hour walking around, I asked for the second bottle of water that he was carrying, and I remember him kind of laughing like, I thought you'd never ask. But after I reminded him how careful girls and boys have to be about spiking, he agreed my caution was fair. And I drank some of Aaron's water. We walked and talked some more, and before long, I noticed that we'd walked all the way to the very edge of the festival site, where it was super dark and very quiet. We traced the edge of the area, and Aaron started to get a little flirty, but I figured that he'd earned a chance to shoot his shot once he'd been walking around with me for so long. But then, it struck me. This very, very concerning thing that we made our way to the quietest part of the site just as I started to feel kind of sick and lightheaded. And it also struck me as really concerning that the feeling of nausea and shakiness had come on right as I was halfway through the water Aaron had given me. I didn't tell him what I suspected. I just asked if we could walk back to the tent, and then started walking very quickly back towards a well-lit public area. Aaron asked if I was okay, and although I told him I was fine, I was feeling more and more shaky and lightheaded with each step I took. I realized that if whatever I was feeling was the result of something I drank, I needed to empty my stomach, and fast. So I made a beeline for the tree line to stick 2 fingers down my throat, but not after telling Aaron, "Don't you follow me," before I did. And I puked my guts up, till nothing but bile came out of my stomach and it was completely empty. And then as I wiped my face clean and wandered back towards Aaron, I felt my head clear. I realized it was probably just the crappy alcohol and lack of decent food making my stomach rebel on me, because almost as soon as I'd puked, I started to feel a bit better again. But as I started to feel better, I started to feel this mix of dumb, mean, and paranoid. I didn't know how to explain it. Aaron hadn't spiked that water. He'd given it to me out of the kindness of his heart, and all the while I'd been half considering him a predator like that wasn't somehow insulting to him. Aaron asked if I was okay, and what was going on that made my mood change on a dime, so I told him straight up. I was so terrified of being spiked that the second I felt unwell, I just assumed it was his fault, and he was some predator who played the long game and tricked me into drugging myself. And I apologized, like it was legitimately heartfelt, and said that I totally considered if he wanted to escape the psycho B-word that he'd met while he still had the chance. But Aaron did the typical Aaron thing and not only accepted my apology, but said that he'd be too scared if all he heard were men are bad horror stories from all those Netflix crime documentaries, which I'd mentioned being into, and I guess had fueled my paranoia a little. He was super understanding about it, but said I owed him a new first date because I'd ruined the first one by accusing him of roofieing me. I agreed to what was a very fair point, and then right as I felt that first romantic spark between us, I saw someone walking over to us. It was the annoying, sweaty drunk guy from before, and not only had he heard Aaron using my real name, he'd heard him talking about our little date. Aaron couldn't see him, but I guess he had read my face when I realized who was walking over, and then by the time he turned, he only managed to get out a word before the drunk guy threw a punch. He might have been sloppy drunk, but the punch that he aimed at Aaron's face was both powerful and accurate. And that might make it sound impressive, but the sound that it made was disgusting, like a slap so loud that it sounded almost like wet. Aaron hit the dirt immediately. He was knocked out cold, and then the guy started talking. "Don't seem like no cousin to me, asshole," he said, all sloppy and all drunk. You think I'm stupid or something, huh? Is that it? You think you're better than me? And I remember yelling, "He can't hear you," at him, but the guy told me to shut up, and then, to my absolute horror, he put his sneaker right on Aaron's head, and then started leaning his weight onto that foot like he was trying to crush his skull. I ran over screaming for him to stop it, pushing the drunk guy off of Aaron before screaming at him to leave us alone. The guy took one look at me and then punched me so hard in the nose that it was immediately dripping with blood by the time I found my feet again. My whole face was on fire from the pain of having my nose punched like that. It didn't break, but holy hell did it hurt like a bitch, and checking it for blood distracted me long enough that I didn't see the drunk guy drop to his knees and start ground pounding on Aaron. That's what it's called, right? When one guy knocks the other down, then just starts punching him while he's done over and over to finish the fight? Well, Aaron was finished the second he got hit. All the guy was doing now was essentially killing him. And I ran over, shoving the drunk guy over, which was easier this time since he was on his knees already. And I've never fought a guy like that before in my life, and I definitely paid for it with a busted nose. But my God, did it feel good to get a few solid smacks in while he was down. I'm glad I did too, because the next second, he was up and had a hand around my throat. But it couldn't have been there for more than a second before someone noticed us and started yelling. And the next thing I know, the drunk guy is throwing me to the ground, and by the time I got up again, I saw maybe 5 or 6 guys running over and pushing him off, saying, "You're hitting a girl, bruh? What is wrong with you, dude?" All that kind of stuff. The drunk guy threw a punch at one of them, then he took one back that knocked him on his ass. But the group showed restraint. They didn't mob him. Instead, one of them got the drunk guy in some kind of judo hold, like grabbing the guy's arm and pulling it, and then he was in way too much pain to do anything but lie there till security essentially showed up. And while security took care of the drunk guy, I asked the guys who came to help me to go get medical help, and they did. A few minutes later, a bunch of first aiders showed up as Aaron was starting to wake up, but by that point, his face was a total mess. The drunk guy had connected with a solid few punches, and his nose, eyebrow, and bottom lip were all bleeding pretty heavily. The medical folks got him on his feet, and then I accompanied him to the little medical tent where he got some basic treatment while being checked out for more serious injuries. It was almost 3:30 in the morning by that point, so Aaron had to call his brother over and over until he woke up. He really did not want to drive all the way out to that festival to give him a ride home, but the moment he heard how badly Aaron was hurt, he jumped out of bed and promised to be there within an hour. Aaron and I waited together on that dirt road that led to the site. Then not long after, his brother showed up, mad as hell about what had happened. We swapped cell numbers before they drove off. And the next day I spent almost the whole ride back texting with Aaron back and forth and arranging that date that I'd promised to let him take me on. And we've been dating ever since. In fact, Aaron is the longest relationship I've ever been in, and we're still going strong almost 3 years later. He sometimes makes fun of the way we first met. Like sometimes he'll bring me coffee and say something like, "Careful now. You don't know what I might have laced that with." But I take it on the chin because nothing worth having comes easy, and trust when I say, it's hard to come by. My name's Ben, and in the summer of 2008, me and a few friends decided that we'd go to the Leeds Festival. And for those that don't know, Leeds Fest is a 3-day music and camping event that's named after where it's held. In years prior, the mostly indie band lineup had never interested us, but when the 2008 lineup was announced, that all changed. Leeds 2007 featured the likes of Arcade Fire and Kings of Leon, with Fall Out Boy delivering a twist of pop punk. But then in 2008, some of the first acts announced were Slipknot, Metallica, and most importantly, Rage Against the Machine. I had been a huge fan of Rage ever since I saw the music video for Sleep Now in the Fire around the year 2000. But since I was only 12 when I got into them, and considering they broke up just a year after that, I thought my chance to see them live had very much come and gone. I was ecstatic in 2007 when rumors of their reformation circulated, but even when they did, I thought that they'd just do a few shows up in the US, but never tour Europe. So when it was announced that they were playing Leeds, I fought tooth and nail to get a ticket, and so did my friends. And to get there, we convinced my friend's dad to drive us down in the back of his van, But not like a people carrier. I'm talking like a big white van with nothing but storage space in the back. And this was very illegal, but very cool, like we were being smuggled into an actual music festival. The vibes were great from there on out, and that first day, we caught Dropkick Murphys, Feeder, Tenacious D, and Metallica. But sadly not Slipknot, as Joey Jordison, rest in peace to the drum god, had to pull out with some health issues. We all headed back to the tents, had a few drinks, and then woke up on that Saturday raring to go. We all liked Metallica, but we had Queens of the Stone Age and Rage to look forward to, so we spent the whole day floating from show to show in anticipation of the big two come the end of the day. The thing is, we weren't the only ones. With them being such a massive band, Queens of the Stone Age pulled a huge audience, and as their set came to a close, the legions of people who'd bought a ticket purely for Rage Against the Machine started filtering through the crowd and closer to the stage. My friends and I did the same, not pushing, but just weaving through the groups of people until we were as close as possible to the band we'd all come to see. The only problem was, that's exactly what everyone else did too. As more and more people pushed their way towards the front, people nearer the back started bunching up too, and before long, my friends and I were all squished together and there was barely room to move. We weren't uncomfortable just yet. Having your personal space violated is all part of the festival experience. But after the band took the stage, then opened with Bulls on Parade, everything changed. As you can imagine, everyone went mental when Rage played their first song, and there was enough moving and jumping around that it opened up a bit of space. But when they finished and went into their second, the crush started. One of my friends, who wasn't that much of a Rage fan, recognized what was coming immediately and said something along the lines of, "I'm getting out of here." But the rest of us stayed thinking it couldn't get any worse. But it did. I remember hearing a girl scream, but not out of enthusiasm. Her friend had passed out and she wasn't strong enough to hold her up. I saw someone trying to help the two girls, but almost everyone else was too distracted by the music and the band on stage to pay attention to anything else. They were right in the middle of the mosh pit too, so people were smashing into them, and after they fell down, they were in real danger of getting trampled by the people who surged forward whenever there was space. I tried to push through the crowd to give the lad helping them a hand, but I realized I couldn't. The crush where I was at was so bad it was getting hard to breathe. If memory serves, Rage were about to launch into their second song, but then they suddenly stopped playing to call attention to what was occurring. People at the front, the ones being crushed up against the metal barriers, were passing out because they couldn't breathe. Security was having to shove people back before dragging the unconscious ones over the barriers, and when Rage's lead singer saw this, he stopped the show and ordered the stage lights to be turned up so people could see what was going on. I had totally lost my friends by then. The crush took us all different ways as people were pushed together and apart and away from one another. The sense of helplessness was horrible, and although I never really got the sense that I might die, I knew that there was a chance others hadn't got so lucky. But as a friend of mine pointed out, there was a kind of naive ignorance in me thinking that, which probably amounts to some kind of mental shield. If the band hadn't stopped the gig when they did, then I really could have been one of those getting crushed or trampled on, and the longer it went on, the worse it would have gotten. Just look at what happened with that Astroworld festival in America. It's absolutely terrifying to know that me and my friends were just minutes away from a very similar, if not identical, outcome. The second there was enough space, I started pushing my way through the crowd quite forcefully, and I won't lie, I was properly panicking by then, and I didn't care if I'd waited almost a decade to see Rage Against the Machine. It wasn't worth losing my life over. The crowd was still so dense in parts that I had to literally shove my way through, and some people didn't take too kindly to that. But I remember one guy tried patting me on the back as I brushed up against him, so he must have read it on my face that I'd been in the crush and was just in survival mode. Once the crowd started to thin out, I remember stopping by another set of barriers with a gap near it, one which loads of people were walking through as they headed back to their tents. I could still see Rage playing, but I mainly stopped there to keep an eye out for my friends. I didn't know if any of them had been the ones dragged over the barriers or if they had been trampled in that mosh pit gone wrong. So as they filed past, one by one over the course of Rage's set, it was a huge relief, and there were many man hugs to go around. We were all quite shaken, and while no one was seriously hurt, our one friend Danny came out the worst of it because he'd fallen into the pit and had his face literally jumped on at one point. There was this massive half-scrape, half-burn type injury on his cheekbone where it really did look like a rubber sole had smashed into his face before slipping. I'd never seen a wound like that, honestly. We asked if he wanted to go to the medical tent or whatever, and he was a bit worried about a concussion and all that, so we went and got him checked out before heading back to our tents. There, we drank away our sorrows that the show of a lifetime had been so scary and anticlimactic. I'd looked forward to it for months, and then 3 minutes in, I'd rather have been anywhere else on the planet, and it sucked. We spent the next day just kind of chilling, catching a band here and there, but mostly just moping around and being gutted that Rage had gone so badly. But it wasn't just that. And looking back on it, it's weird that we kind of pushed all these thoughts to the back of our minds, probably so we wouldn't have to address it and we could at least try to enjoy the rest of the festival. But then after we got back and found out people had heard about the crush, there was no hiding from it. A few people had to go to the hospital because of how badly they'd been crushed, and the fact that we hadn't been in the worst parts of the crush was a matter of pure luck. If we'd been a little closer to that stage and Rage hadn't had the presence of mind to stop the gig when they did, the situation could have been much, much worse. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday and Thursday at 9 p.m. Eastern Time, and there are super fun live streams every Sunday and Wednesday night. If you got a story, be sure to submit them over at my email, letsreadsubmissions@gmail.com, and you might even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks for members of the channel, such as me sending Freddy Fazbear to your house. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories in big compilations. Located anywhere you listen to podcasts, all links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends, and remember... Russell!